Mick Wallace, he has been called a lot of things. I looked up not your CV, but texts written about you. Of course, terrorist supporter, pro-prostitution, anti-Zionist, activist. I think you're proud of that one. But you're eccentric and unconventional. Eccentric and unconventional. Let's listen to your eccentricity, Mick.
How's it going? I hope my Irish accent, they say my Irish accent is a lot worse than Claire's. I came from the countryside, and I didn't have as refined an education as Claire. Anyway, this is my first time in Norway, so thanks very much for inviting us. A bit unfair to be asked to speak after Claire and Andrew, but sure, I'll say a few words anyway. And look at, we're living in very dangerous times. Things do seem madder than they used to be. But since Napoleon in 1798, Western powers have used their military might to impose their will on others. And it hasn't really stopped. And using violence, they never seem to have gone past the point that you have to be violent to get your way, and you have to crush your opponent in order to get your way. Which reminds me, and this, sorry, forgive me for going off on a tangent. Last year, the Americans completed their 29th military base in Africa, and the Chinese completed their 29th rail network. Now, both of them take what they can out of the place, but the Chinese have a different way of doing it. But what Israel has been doing for a long time, I suppose for 75 years, and I suppose more horrifically and visibly in the last 11 months, is just imposing constant violence on the Palestinian people. They bomb them, they shoot them, they imprison them, they torture them, and they go to great efforts to make sure that they don't see them as human beings. We kind of wonder, how can you do this to another people? But we also wonder how our wonderful institutions in Europe, like the European Union, the Council, the Parliament, and the Commission, how can they support it? How can they actually watch the cruelty and the destruction and the slaughter of children and women and men at the level that we've seen? How can the Europeans actually support it? How can the Americans give 60 standing ovations to Netanyahu, to Congress? How can they applaud him when he says Israel killed no civilians in Gaza? How does that happen? What's happened to the European Union? How have we come to this point? Well, I suppose Borrell put it in context. Joseph Borrell, our High Representative for Foreign Affairs in the European Union, and he compared the jungle and the garden. He said Europe was a garden and the rest was a jungle. He was putting things as they see them. And the truth be told, colonialism never really stopped. And our European politicians have a colonial mindset today. They haven't moved on from it. We're supposed to be the civilized world. The civilized world. We go back to the Renaissance and further. We know it all. And we have values, as Claire said, not just interests. And we have shared values with people that cause untold destruction and misery to others. We think the Chinese have no values. And they had an organized society 5,000 years ago. They haven't dropped a bomb on anyone in 45 years. We think the Iranians are barbarians because they think different from us. We lecture them on how they treat their women, but it's okay to slaughter the women in Gaza. The media and the politicians turned a blind eye to Afghanistan for 20 years as US NATO bombs dropped on their people. But then when the Americans were going to leave, oh my God, this is terrible. How can you abandon the Afghan women? Oh my God. And the media became incredibly exercised by what was happening in Afghanistan. After 20 years of US NATO destruction, with loads of involvement from our own European member states, 20 years, and then they're worried about the Americans leaving the place? Because they're leading it to a Taliban, and the Afghan people were treated so badly by the invading forces, they actually thought that maybe the Taliban can't be any worse. And God knows the Taliban, it wouldn't be very nice. I wouldn't like to be living under them myself. But yet, when the Americans left, and there was no chance of American bombs killing their women and children anymore, but now it was the Taliban. Oh God, the Taliban are terrible. And then the Europeans and the Americans introduced sanctions because the Taliban were back in power. Oh, they're an awful crowd. So we introduced sanctions against them. Sanctions. What are sanctions? Sanctions are designed to impact on the population in the hope that they'll change the government. Sanctions are brutal, every bit as brutal as war. In 1 year alone, 40,000 people died from sanctions in Venezuela because they wouldn't play ball with their imperial masters. Sanctions have killed a lot of women and children in Iran. Sanctions have killed a lot of women and children in Syria. Our sanctions. Today, the Americans have sanctions on over 40 different countries in the world, and the Europeans are following suit on many of them. And their sanctions are illegal unless they have the blessing of the UN. So most of the sanctions are illegal. And our wonderful European Union is imposing them like confetti this weather. And anyone who they have a problem with. Anyone who doesn't lie down to the interest of US empire. Sanctions are as an ugly and economic form of warfare as bombs can be. Sometimes even worse. So there were sanctions then placed on the Afghan people, and there was millions of them starving. And our politicians and media lost interest again. Oh, let's move on. No war there anymore. Just bad things happening. So they lost interest. How can the media play such a significant role in how we think about these things? Who owns the media? Because it has become a bigger problem. When I said that Western powers have been imposing their will on others illegally through military might since 1798, I don't want to go through all the terrible wars that happened since. But just in our recent history, in my lifetime, the millions killed in Afghanistan, the millions killed in Vietnam, the millions killed in Korea. After the fall of the Soviets, we had the invasion of Iraq, where they were able to kill 500,000 children with sanctions, and Madeleine Albright, the US Secretary of State, thought it was a price worth paying to control the price of oil. They went back into Afghanistan in 2001, stayed there for 20 years. They went into Iraq in 2003, bombed Libya back to the Stone Age in 2011. Have been destabilizing Syria for more than 10 years at this stage, where they've literally funded ISIS, funded Al-Qaeda in order to bring about regime change. And all the while, we demonize their rulers, but not the aggressor. Today, it is very difficult to get the truth from the mainstream media. Do you ever wonder why over 90% of the MEPs in the European Parliament actually agree with war? Twice last year, no, once in 2022 and once in 2023, myself and Claire had an amendment in to the resolution on Ukraine. And our amendment called on the EU to maximise its potential to commence diplomacy and dialogue with a view to ending the war and bringing about peace. Do you know that over 80% of the MEPs voted against that? Most of the others abstained. And the handful that voted for that were Putin puppets. 80% of the MEPs elected by the people, you people, not yous in Norway, but elected by the people, 80% of them didn't want the war in Ukraine to stop. You know, it's the first time in my lifetime where the European politicians have made no effort whatsoever to stop a war that took place in Europe. They actually made sure that it kept going. And we have poured billions of EU citizens' money into that war to make sure that it doesn't stop. There's hundreds of thousands of Ukrainians dead. And no one gives a damn about them. Our European politicians don't care how many Ukrainians die or how many Russians die. They want to help the Americans to undermine Russia. And what's in it for us? Are we well? We're buying LNG from the Americans now, replacing Russian gas. We're paying way more money for it. I'll tell you how bad it is. A company in Germany making cars compared to a company in America making the same car. The German company is now paying 4 times more for the LNG than the American company is. Now, how clever is that? You know, we used to think that, you know, countries, they do things in their self-interest and, you know, they only give a fuck about themselves and whatever happens. But in actual fact, it looks like the Western Europeans on this occasion are in kamikaze mode. We are undermining our own economy. We're undermining our own security. I challenged a guy at a European Foreign Affairs Committee saying that, he says, we have to get Crimea back. And I said, well, don't you think now that the Russians would actually see that as an existential crisis for them and they ain't going to give up Crimea too handy? And that you think, I said, do you think it'd be worth it, I said, that the Europeans get so involved and the Americans in the Ukraine war to a point where you can take back Crimea? And I said, you're risking a possible nuclear war. Do you think that's a price worth paying? And he said, I'm afraid so. Well, God help us. We had Blinken and Biden telling us in the last couple of months that nuclear war, well, it's not really much worse than climate change. Now, the same fellas are doing nothing for environment. In fact, speaking of the environment, last year the Americans allocated $12 billion to the Environmental Protection Agency to deal with climate change matters. $12 billion. They gave $10 billion to the Agency for Disease Control. And which did they give the arms industry? They gave them $930 billion. And that's just to the arms companies alone. The Americans spend over $1.5 trillion now maintaining their military might across the world. They have over 800 military bases. They make up over 6% of the carbon footprint in the world today. They're responsible over 6% of the emissions, the military, and the Greens in the European Parliament refuse to talk about the carbon footprint from the military. They don't want to know about it. It's horrific that 2% of the emissions are coming from shipping. That is just terrible. And it's terrible that 2.5% of the emissions are coming from aviation. But it's okay that over 6% are coming from military. That's okay. We won't go there. We won't measure their emissions. Are the military ruling the world? Are the dumb politicians promoting them and helping them? Are they actually in control now? I mean, do you ever worry about who runs these countries right across Europe and America in particular? Who's running them? The gobshites. Most of them haven't a clue, like. Seriously. There's a serious deficit in intelligence around governance today. A serious level of it. We heard that, what's she one, the Prime Minister of Finland, Marian Sana. She came to the European Parliament and she told us that the sanctions that they're putting on Russia, they must be felt by every ordinary Russian on the street. That's called collective punishment. How did she get to be running the country? It's shocking. But where are we going with all this? What are we going to do about it? Are we going to continue to put 90% of right-wing politicians in power across Europe when only half the population are of a right-wing mindset because the other half are more left-wing? Society is generally divided in two, but our politicians are not. So who helps them to get into power? Why is it so difficult for people with a different mindset and someone that doesn't accept the mainstream narrative? How has it come so hard for them to get into power? Well, money and the control of the mainstream media has a lot to do with it. But we've got to change that. Mainstream media has been bought. The National Endowment for Democracy, the American agency, they actually boast about spending money in every country in the world promoting independent media. They are buying and paying for the narrative. They are now controlling an incredible amount of academia across Europe. Why have we allowed this to happen? Our governments are accepting grants from these people so that they can influence the curriculum instead of paying for it themselves. But things can change. I'm an optimist, and by God, it's not easy sometimes. But you know what? I really believe in the people, and I do think that things have got so bad and the level of credibility of politicians and the mainstream media today has been shattered. And more people are starting to see it. But as Claire said, we have to take power back. And it is called people power, as Claire said. And it doesn't have to be violent. But we have the numbers. They don't. They have the money. But we've the numbers. And we can all make a difference. Now, they say that Western society or Western powers could make the world a much better place very easily by stop doing what they're doing. That wouldn't cost them a lot. But we, as a people, we can change the direction that the organization of our society is going. And I love to quote Noam Chomsky. He was giving a talk in New York one night. And a girl stood up at the question and answer session near the end. This is 25 years ago. And she says to Chomsky, "There's something I don't understand," she says. "There's so much power and money against you. I mean, how do you keep going? How do you think that you can make things better and change the way things are going?" And Chomsky said, "You know," he says, "everyone in the world, every person in the world can help to make the world a better place each day. And sometimes it only takes a smile."